When people think about plants, generally they will think about things with a lot of leaves, flowers, that sort of thing. And they're right to think that way. I do want most of the plants that you draw for this lesson to be focused on leafy things, mainly because in this lesson we're focusing primarily on the idea of getting your leaves to flow through space in a way that is confident and smooth, rather than getting trapped into drawing stiff, lifeless things. But I do want you to try, at least here and there, maybe a couple drawings, objects that are more solid, that don't necessarily have leaves, but still fall into the subject matter of plant life. So I do have another video demo about cactuses, or cacti. This one is going to cover mushrooms. So we'll be drawing this king oyster mushroom. It's basically just got a really nice sense of volume to it. It's a solid object, and it's very organic, so it really extends from our organic forms in lesson 2. So it's got a lot of great room for contour lines, but for the most part, you'll see that we don't need to overuse these contour lines. That's something that a lot of students tend to do. They will just, because they don't really think about what a contour line is meant to do and what its purpose is, they'll just draw a bunch of these all the way through without any regard for what they're really trying to achieve. And in doing so, they gradually take these nice, fluid, organic forms and they start to stiffen them up, because contour lines aren't inherently natural. They're very useful tools for us, but the more that you add them, the more something starts to feel man-made and kind of like machinery. And so we only use as many as is necessary. Frequently, you'll run into a situation where you only need the one. One contour line can be enough. Maybe add a pole here with a contour ellipse, but that's enough. It'll feel more solid, and you'll be able to lean into it and kind of believe for yourself that it is a solid form. So here we're going to try and we're going to use contour lines for sure, because they're a great tool and you should absolutely use them. But whenever you put them down, think about the purpose that mark is meant to serve. Don't overdo it, and put more time into crafting one confident, smooth, and effective contour line rather than putting together a bunch of very sloppy ones, because those sloppy ones won't do half the job that one good one will accomplish. So let's go ahead and move this mushroom reference over to the side. And let's get started. So I am immediately jumping in and building a few simple cross sections. We can do this around a minor axis. Here I'm not worrying too much about it because this is a wobbly form. I just want to make sure that they are roughly aligned to each other. If you end up a little bit off, it's not really that big of a deal, but you don't want to end up with a lot that are like this, and you do want to be mindful of their degrees. Down here, we're able to see much more of the face of this ellipse, of this cross-section, than we are up here because of the angle at which we're looking at it. So if we were here, we're seeing much less of this one here than we are of this ellipse down here. You can see that the angle is much larger. And so that's essentially how those degrees work. And we've covered this in previous lessons. So just make sure that you're not ending up in a situation where you have a bunch of very small ones down here or very large ones where you would not be looking at that cross-section head-on. So you really do have to think about where this object is relative to you. Put yourself in the position of the viewer and think about how these cross sections relate to where your head is. And so applying a similar methodology to the branches, where we are creating segments that we can control but blending them together, I construct the outside of this form. And as you can see here, I'm tapering, I'm kind of curving it gently because it is an organic form. You can see it right here that the transitions are very smooth. It's not going to be robotic and stiff. Your lines flow smoothly. Now, I haven't drawn this cap yet. So right now, we're only concerned with what lies underneath it. We're going to treat this like a separate form that we will tack on in the next step. But for now, I keep getting this misaligned. There. Right now, we're really just interested in constructing this form here. And you'll see down here, I've created a nice strong base for it with this ellipse. We don't actually get that kind of information from this reference image, but you do have to think about the fact that, well, this form is sitting up pretty straight. It's got a bunch of other forms or objects next to it that might be helping support it, but reasonably, it's probably got a bit of a flatter base. And so I gave it a big wide base like this rather than having made it kind of rounded. I feel like this would have compromised its ability to balance. And so that was kind of a decision that I made in terms of how I felt this form would be best constructed. We could always just go and find other reference material for it, and I'm sure that we'd find that this thing actually was obviously growing straight out of the ground, so it doesn't really matter what its base would look like. I made this decision because I felt that it made the form that I was creating as solid as possible. It's very similar to what I mentioned in a previous video, where when you're drawing something that is open-ended, you want to avoid this kind of situation, and instead you want to cap it off. And so it's like you're cutting it off somewhere, except here, instead of cutting it, I'm giving it a solid base. I'm modifying it for my own purposes. And so next, I've tacked on this cap form. And so you can see here that this one has certain irregularities, the one in the actual reference. It's not perfectly smooth, but the thing is that all of these little changes, all of these little irregularities, they're essentially complexity. And with construction, we move from simple to complex. And so if you want to achieve this, first, it's better to construct something that is smooth and simple that you can make feel solid, and then you can go back in, if you want to add that complexity. It all works in phases. You're essentially looking at certain resolutions of an object where at its outermost resolution, it's a very simple blobby form, but as you get closer and closer, you see more form detail or form irregularity and complexity. Now, let's bring the opacity back on this. Obviously, this mushroom doesn't have a whole lot going in it, but it does have these very prominent ridges. And that's getting into the territory of texture. That's one thing that I really like about mushrooms. Structurally, they are dead simple. So, which is why I want you to get into it now, because when we get into the next lesson, insects and all that, they have a lot more going on. Whereas here, we can really just start out getting the sense of building solid forms. And so now we're already into worrying about texture. And so when I construct these ridges here, actually I should have been turning off the black so you could see what was changing between these phases. Anyway, You can also see actually here that I added a little bit more to this cap to kind of make for this irregularity, or to compensate for it rather. And so while I'm doing it, I'm not just adding a flat shape. I'm not just adding a line. What I'm doing is I'm thinking about how it is an entire slice, a three-dimensional slice that I'm adding. I'm just being very bold to kind of clarify it. This is a whole chunk here. It's an entire form, a three-dimensional form that continues on along this side here. And so if we were to look at it, you'd see that it's got a bottom face, and then it's got this stuff going on along the top. I'm essentially adding another form to flesh this form out because I felt that it wasn't close enough to what I was going for with this mushroom. When you add additional forms, don't think about them as just being flat shapes. You need to understand how they incorporate themselves into the three-dimensional construction that is already present. This is actually the reason why I frequently tell people to avoid situations where they're running into subtractive construction. The most common case is with leaves, where they'll construct their basic leaf shape, and then they will cut back into it, usually zigzagging, something like that. And the reason that I want you to avoid this is because when you cut back into something, in order to be able to do it successfully, you really need to be able to think about how the form that you're cutting away exists in 3D space in relation to the object itself. And so usually, instead of cutting back like this to create a jagged line, we'll add on to it. We'll construct additively. And we'll do this coming off that initial line and going back to it. And we'll do it in separate segments. And this helps us maintain the solidity of the form that was there previously without undermining it. And so that's what we're doing here. We had a surface, and then we thought about how you can add, if we were to cut off a piece of it, how you can add another chunk to it while respecting the three-dimensional form that was already there. Anyway, back to the point that I was raising here with these ridges. Here we're just breaking into texture. And so the main element here that I'm seeing are the valleys between the ridges. And so I decided to capture at least some of them, just so I could get a general sense of it. Obviously, there's a lot more going on than that. And so in the next step, I've broken it down just a little bit more, where instead of just these simple lines that are coming all the way down, they're not lines, they are shadows. Everything in here that we see is essentially a shadow being cast by the ridges themselves. We're not drawing the ridges, we're drawing the shadows that end up being caught up between them. Due to an effect called ambient occlusion, as light bounces around, it finds it more difficult to get into the little cracks and crevices, creating this kind of shadow. And so here, now, instead of following the continuous major ones, I'm finding the smaller shadow shapes, and I'm outlining them all individually. As you'll see later, I'm not necessarily going to fill these in, because I want to be in full control over what is drawing people's attention. And while a nice solid black shape is going to draw less attention than something with a lot of contrast in it and a lot of visual noise, I also don't want the kind of bold footprint to be everywhere. And so I always start out my shadows and my shadow shapes by outlining them. Then I can decide whether or not I feel it's appropriate to fill them in. And so here, I've moved on from this section. We'll go back to it in a bit, but I've moved on to the little bits and pieces that are present in this. You've got little, if you really look at a mushroom, you'll find that the cap is often very spongy, and it's got little holes and little pits and stuff in it. And so I wanted to try and capture some of those. There's a lot of little, like, not scratches, but like valleys. And so I was just roughly trying to capture that illusion along the top. And I'm generally I err on the side of less texture rather than more. I don't want to rely on any randomness or chaos, and I don't want to kind of bury my drawing in detail. Detail is really the last thing that I'm interested in. And you'll notice that as I'm drawing this stuff, I'm maintaining the curvature of the form. The marks don't ever run in a way that contradicts the form that I've already constructed. Because I've gone through all these steps to really establish the illusion of form in my own mind, because I believe it so strongly, I'm able to maintain this without worrying too much about it. It's not so much conscious thought as much as it is I've been fooled enough to just go along with it subconsciously. And so I'm thinking more about, well, I want to put little pits here, and I want to put little scars along the surface, and so I'm going to wrap them around as needed. Now here, there's a couple things going on. I've added a cast shadow. Here there isn't actually much of one. You can actually see that the light underneath here is bouncing up and lighting this underside of the form. And I don't care too much about that. I'm more interested in separating visually the cap from the stalk. And so it becomes more a question of, this is my drawing, this is my construction, I'm in control of what I'm communicating, and therefore I need to look at all the tools that I have to do so to achieve my goals. And so I'm communicating the idea that there is this mushroom, and the mushroom's cap is separate from the stalk. And so I'm using some little subtle hints to that effect. And so by applying this cast shadow, it's just like the daisy demo, where I used subtle little shadows to separate the petals where they were getting very layered and a little bit visually confusing. And so here I could really clarify just what is going on. The other thing that I am doing here is adding teeny tiny little bumps along the silhouette. And when we talked about texture in lesson 2, we talked about how important the silhouette is. In this mushroom, it's actually a pretty low resolution image, so not the best choice. But there wasn't a whole lot going on that you can see on the silhouette. But I did know the nature of this material, and I decided that to best convey just the fact that it's not a smooth, slick surface, that it's got just a little bit of irregularity to it, I put in just a couple little bumps and notches and things to really communicate the fact that this is irregular. The last thing that I want to do is throw away the silhouette. If there's anything that I want to communicate, I'm going to take advantage of it. And so finally here, it's really just a little bit of extra detail. There's more little irregularities and pits and stuff. You'll notice that here, I'm not drawing circles. I'm drawing what's more like little crescents. Because I know that whenever you have a pit or a hole or a pore in something, the light is always coming from one side. And so the light, in this case of this red one here, the light would be coming from this angle. It would be hitting the section here, lighting it and obliterating any shadow that we might have, and therefore obliterating the quote-unquote line or edge that we might be drawing. But it's going to cast at the same time a little shadow shape along the opposite side, creating a sort of crescent. So you'll notice that most of these are not going to be solid enclosed circles. And so that's really it. Mushrooms are great because they really get you into the flow of construction without having to worry too much about it. They're really just two major forms. You've got that stalk, and you've got the cap. And in terms of texture, they're also quite interesting in that some of them have little blobs and beads. And so there's a lot there to play with in terms of learning to imply the presence of these tiny forms that are along the surface with the shadows that they cast. And so I think it's a great place to kind of get into it before we start breaking into the lesson 4 insects, which tend to have a lot more going on. No, I'm just getting away from myself. So in essence, that's drawing a mushroom. I hope that helped. Again, there will be a full text and step-by-step image breakdown of the same demo. So be sure to check that out. The link will be in the description, and you can follow along and kind of go at your own pace rather than having to keep up with the video. It actually is quite helpful to draw along with the demos, and so being able to do that without having to pause and play and listen to my nasally voice can definitely be helpful. So give that a try.